Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and I'm with Peter Mantello, and he's with Ritsumeikan Asian Pacifiica University, and has been teaching there and focusing on technology and workers and how technology is changing the workplace and how it affects working people. And he's written an article, actually, called Machine That Ate People. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. the role of technology and how it's being used to exploit and spy on working people. So welcome to Workweek. So Peter, the transformation of society and particularly the workplace with the introduction of technology is massive. And most working people are unaware of how this technology is being used and being introduced into the workplace. There's no, and of course in the United States, there's no studies about how it affects people prior to being introduced. They have a free hand, corporations like Amazon and others, to introduce the technology. And of course it's been built up that this is going to be a new world which is going to help people. In fact, computers, when they first came, the media said this is going to be great, it's going to create freedom, you won't have to do menial jobs, will be taken away because of computers and technology. And you have a situation now of a massive wealth of tech companies that have used their technological developments to increase their profits. Let's talk about some things that are raised in your book. First, what they are, deep data.
I think technology, ever since the late 19th century, has been used as a tool to enhance productivity. But also, the flip side to that is technology has been a way to augment supervision of the worker. In the late 19th century, you have the punch clock, which became, in many ways, kind of a replacement for the eyes of the foreman. But also it sped up the accounting process. And increasingly what we see with technology is more, shall we say, more invasive ways in which to surveil the worker, to ensure that the worker is working, but working at the optimum of his productive potential. And since the rise of the computer, the rhetoric behind that rise in the industry that wanted to use the computer as a way to facilitate higher degrees of productivity, it was seen as a tool of liberation, meaning that, like many forms of technology, the rhetoric is it would unchain the worker, it would allow the worker greater periods of freedom. But as we've seen with the internet, and the fact that most workers today are responsible for receiving their emails or responding to their emails at any time of the day, what we're seeing is that the computer and technology itself is becoming more and more a form of surveillance. And instead of being a liberator, it's more something that is enslaving people.
So it's a 24-hour workday.
It's like a 24-hour workday. And as we were talking about before, the idea, what we see today, especially with gig economy and the use of platform work, we see this sort of the rhetoric behind companies like Uber and Lyft talking about the ability of people to be their own boss. And as a matter of fact, as you know, Uber and Lyft, they don't call their drivers employees, because that would open them for greater responsibility to these people. They're called associates. And they've used that successfully in many countries. Whereas in other countries today, what we're seeing in Europe is pushback where, in fact, people who work for these platform companies are actually employees, and as such, they're entitled to benefits that normal employees have in the normal workplace.
And this is part of deregulation, making everybody an independent contractor.
Right. The gig economy is essentially to create enough precarity in the world where corporations can make more profit at the expense of people because they don't have to pay them like they do lifetime employees.
And there's also the propaganda about smart cities, that this observation of people, their habits, their spending habits, and everything they do is going to make a smart city. What is that reality of that?
Well, I think there's several things happening with smart cities, and I always like to look at things because I'm an academic. I always like to think about things with a certain lens or window in which you use theory in which to sort of make sense of what's going on in the world. And I think Michel Foucault's writings on biopolitics is very, very applicable because, the theory of biopolitics is that society itself tries to optimize productivity of populations, and in which to do that, life becomes the center of that. So finding ways to harvest life. And we see that taking place with social media, for example, the notion of communication being monetized. But also what we see with smart cities is we see increasing forms of surveillance that take place. When you talk about surveillance, you're talking about power relationships where you have the watcher and the watched. And of course, you can monetize those power relationships in so many ways. You can create efficiency. But as Foucault says, the darker side to biopolitics is that in the drive of society to optimize populations, the productivity of populations, the human element becomes increasingly less significant.
And the development of the deep data, like in China, for example, also has been used to apparently control or monitor people. If they illegally cross a sidewalk, they get a ticket automatically. Social behavior is, through the use of deep data, is affected and controlled. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that most of the public relations or rhetoric of the AI industry is built on the idea of the promise of personalization, the promise of neoliberal cost-effective use of technologies. But what people don't realize is that AI feeds on data, and it feeds on the data of people like every individual. And that data is the source, is the driving engine of big data, because constant for AI to work, it needs data sets. So AI is sort of like a monster. It's a machine that basically feeds on people's information. And of course, today what we have, especially in places like China, but I think we see a lot of Chinophobia going on and talking about the authoritarian nature of China.
Well, even here, tracking people, what they buy. These companies are tracking people.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, today now, in the 2022, thanks to the work of people like Shoshana Zuboff, we are becoming more and more familiar with the term surveillance capitalism, meaning a new genus of wealth creation based upon the harvesting of personal data that comes from institutions, personal data that comes from our online shopping behavior, personal data that comes from our use of social media. All that behavioral data is being collected, oftentimes without our knowledge, and it's being sold. And many privacy advocates are saying that here we have a system today of surveillance capitalism where these huge corporations are making phenomenal amounts of money off of our work, off of our own personal data, and we receive no benefit from that.
So in other words, if you use these social media platforms like Facebook, they're getting that information and using it to profit from it. And you're doing the work. You're providing the information.
Yeah, the classic line is we are Mark Zuckerberg's product. Without us, Mark Zuckerberg would not be the one of the richest men in the world today.
And this deregulation in the United States, the capitalists say, well, we can't regulate. these companies, we have to have freedom to develop the technology. That would impinge on technological development.
Well, there's a whole ontology of thinking about the notion of commerce, in America, the idea of the buyer beware is a very important part of it. It's up to the individual to read those impossible consent forms. Every time you click, it's up to you. And if you do that, then if you don't, well, that's your problem. And of course, technology is always a buzzword for politicians because it means innovation, and the concept of innovation means jobs. It's tied to the idea of economic prosperity. And for technology to work, especially artificial intelligence, as I said before, it means eroding privacy laws. And you have a fundamental different approach to the notion of privacy in America than you do in Europe. In Europe, they're much more cautious with the idea of data collection, and things like the general data protection laws in Europe are far more stringent than they are in America.
And even in Sweden, the introduction of new technology, like scanners, for example, the scanning machine, they do testing to find out how they affect workers. In the United States, scanners were introduced, and you had carpal tunnel syndrome as a result of clerks. So a massive number of injuries to the hands and that kind of thing. So there was no protection from this technology, even though there was studies that showed that it would be harmful to workers.
The technologies that are used in the workplace, let's call them automated management systems, rely on biometrics. Biometrics are the measurement of body. And since the 1980s, biometrics have been used, for example, eye scanners, more frequently with GPS for commercial vehicle companies to track the location of workers.
And their temperature even now. Amazon, the temperature of drivers.
Exactly. In-body temperature of drivers. But, the area of research that we're working on now is emotional AI, which is technologies that claim to be able to detect, read, and to measure the emotions of people. So what you see is a far more invasive form of surveillance, or a far more invasive form of surveillance that is going into very private and intimate places of a person's subjective state. And these technologies use very interesting biometrics where they look at like respiration rate, heart rate, skin conductance levels, which is the amount of sweat on your skin, eye tracking micro expressions on your face, and then of course using big data and machine learning to come up with readings of a person's emotions. But the problem here is that the science itself is quite flaky. There are two basic problems with the science. One is that the actual science community has no agreement and has contested exactly what emotions are and where they come from. One side of the debate is that emotions are hardwired into your physical body and that people just react. And the other camp says that emotions are contingent on socially and culturally contingent. And of course, much of the facial recognition systems that are being used today rely on a now discredited template that was created by a sociologist called Paul Ekman in the late 20th century, where Paul Ekman decided that universally humans had 6 emotions. And since facial recognition pushback within the last, I would say, 3 years, there are many scholars that are saying that this is pretty flaky because all cultures express their emotions differently. For example, in Thailand, one of the most common emotions that a person will display when they are embarrassed is they'll smile or they'll laugh. Whereas in Russia, Russians are known for not smiling at all sometimes, So
So your cultural differences affect your expressions and your emotions.
yeah, exactly. Culture is a great determiner of person's emotional, the way people express emotions.
Now, algorithms have been used to track people and to find out what people are going to do, and has led to discrimination. Algorithms, the difference between blacks and whites, have targeted. Why don't you talk about the use of algorithms and biomed technology?
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because my focus within the last couple of years has been on AI in the workplace. And the problem with the technologies that are being created and the algorithms that are being used is that many of these algorithms that are created, many of these technologies are being built here in Silicon Valley. And so we have programmers who are deciding on what happiness is, what sadness is. And the problem here is that these technologies are being marketed globally across the world, and they're not tweaked for for any forms of diversity, gender. They're not tweaked for gender, for ethnicity, for race. So we have this sort of generic type of technology, but of course it's being used all over the place. And right now I say that there's this bandwagon going on where because of this perfect storm of disaster capitalism, which is COVID, and surveillance capitalism coming together, we have these companies, and where I work in Japan, companies that have been historically, traditionally reluctant to embrace new technologies, all of a sudden embracing these technologies without questioning the validity of the science behind them.
And one of the things driving it is a profiteering from the introduction of these new technologies. Why don't you talk about Neo-taylorism, post-Fordism, what that means in the workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting because the concept of Taylorism was to maximize efficiency of the worker and to make the worker essentially a replaceable cog in a larger machine. To sort of like to despecialize things, so that basically you could replace that worker. And of course, with that comes the lack of worker rights, because the workers no longer have bargaining power because they're so easy to replace.
Everybody's an independent contractor.
Everyone's an independent contractor. It's interesting, post-war studies showed that when they started to use statistics in human resource management, they found that there were costs to neo-taylorism, meaning that to optimize the productivity in the workers were forced to work harder, because they were being monitored more quickly. But the downside to that was there was starting to be an increase in worker absences, worker illnesses. And what we see today is the leading cause of worker absences today that cost the global workplace over $1 trillion now is work-related absences due to stress. And that stress being either from the precarity of the situation where a large degree of workers are contract workers now, or more invasive forms of surveillance. And so what you have in a situation is where in the post-war world, companies started to realize in order to offset the high medical costs that they were paying for all these worker absences, to focus on workness wellness programs that sort of concentrated on the physical body. Because at that point in time, there was no way to quantify emotions. Emotions were considered by management theorists like Peter Drucker to be irrational. So the idea to be able to even be concerned with emotions was problematic. But then what you see happening in the last 10, 15 years, you have an industry in computation and AI that suddenly says that we can quantify emotions. We have the technology now and the know-how and the algorithms to measure people's emotional state. And if we are able to understand the people's emotional state, then we will be better able to manage them and to alleviate this. We'll be able to find all these new sources of workplace wellness programs that are cost effective.
And this idea of empathetic surveillance of how people behave and their character. I mean, if you say that there's an increase in stress, wouldn't this create more problems in society? I mean, if people are stressed out and want to escape or take drugs, the use of drugs, medication, marijuana, for example, you feel that you need medication to deal with stress in the society that's created by the development of capitalism.
Yeah, studies have shown that people under surveillance experience heightened levels of stress when you're being watched. For example, when I teach the surveillance studies at my school, I ask people, the classic question of, Foucault's panopticon, where do you think you would react differently if there was a video camera in your house? Would it change your behavior if you knew you're being constantly watched? Would it cause you any amount of stress? And of course, the answer is always yes. Anybody who is under 24-hour surveillance, they change their behavior. Like in, Foucault's idea of the panopticon, the idea that if someone is being exposed to surveillance 24 hours a day, it will create a form of soul training, But what we have today is we have this technology that wants to make transparent people's emotions. So there is this impossibility of people to backstage. I mean, the idea that they can't create this sort of like facade of being happy. So we call this a form of mood policing or emotional policing. And so the idea of shiny, happy people, the idea that in order to be productive, you have to be happy, you have to be aware, Whereas, this idea of attitudinal conformity, which it simply is wrong because people are different. People express their moods different. People have different behaviors. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're less productive or they're a bad worker,
But isn't the drive for profits and productivity behind a lot of this technology, that they want to increase the profits of these corporations?
Of course, it's all based on neoliberal efficiency of finding technological solutions to for essentially problems that are being created by the whole system of globalization, short contract, and of course, this technology itself is being used or sold as a solution to problems, for systemic problems that are far deeper in terms of the global capitalist system of trying to exploit the worker to the nth degree.
And these automation, AI and robotics as well, are leading to potentially losses of millions of jobs of workers, that capitalism doesn't need these workers if they can automate them out of their work. Is that another area of stress for people, that they're afraid of being automated out of their jobs?
It's interesting because we've done a series of surveys, and there have been surveys done by like the World Health Organization on the 10 greatest fears of AI. And one of those was redundancy, that the machine is going to make people redundant. But interestingly enough, in the studies we've done with future job seekers, students who are about to graduate, people who are in the job market, they're not so worried about being replaced by AI. Their greatest fear is being managed by AI, having a boss who's non-human, so a form of non-human resource management, which means that all of a sudden all their productivity is transformed into numbers. So there's no sort of social involvement. There's no human element in the sort of the relationship between the employee and the employer. It's a machine.
And that's happened at Amazon already.
Amazon is a case in point where, if you're a warehouse worker, you are a prosthetic of the machine, of the big machine, and you're given a scanner, and the scanner has a countdown. Every time you receive an order, you're given a certain period of time in which to fulfill that order. And of course, the scanner, the algorithms in the scanner are connected to where exactly the product that warehouse picker is supposed to pick is located. And as you know, these warehouses are the size of 2 or 3 football fields. And if an employee does not make it by the countdown time, they receive a warning. And if an employee receives 3 warnings, then they can be terminated. And the termination can actually take place on their screen where there's no interaction with the manager themselves. So here you see a very dystopian future, which could probably take place with Amazon. And Amazon now has a patent for a wrist bracelet which will replace the scanner. So they'll just be using their hands to pick the item.
And they probably like to embed chips in your brain. So
they're not embedding microchips into people's brains as of yet, but they are embedding them into people's skin. There are several companies in Sweden, for example, which are asking, where employees are actually volunteering to have micro implants into their wrists or parts of around their hand, which will sort of allow them not to be. They won't need a smart card, so they'll be able to enter and they'll have access to various offices. They'll have access to the photocopy machine. They'll have access to the coffee machine, the vending machine. All these things are already taking place. It's very scary.
And at UPS today in the United States, there's a contract for UPS workers that are represented by the Teamsters, and they're having a campaign that while they have money to put video cameras in the trucks, they don't have money for air conditioning, and in the heat wave, the climate crisis, they're saying why? Why is that? Is our life worth less than watching us by the money you put into the TV cameras?
Yeah, this is again. It's surveillance is always linked to control, and the idea here is to it goes back to Taylor's early one of the great lines from Taylor is that an unwatched worker is a dangerous worker. Because for Taylor, the worker is either going to not do anything. He'll try his best not to do anything, or he'll actually try to sabotage the assembly line to slow down the means of production.
And the rise of fascism now in the United States and around the world, in the United States is portrayed as freedom. We need more freedom, but it seems like that if you had a fascist government, they could introduce these technologies even more into society. And the Democrats and Republicans ideologically are saying that capital should have the right to do that.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things about the technology is the ability of people to opt in or opt out. In the workplace, people don't have the ability. In some workplaces, it's either if you don't like being surveilled, then go elsewhere.
It's your choice. It's the choice economy.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't like it, then leave. And so those situations are really scary. Also, just situations where technology is being used in public spaces without your knowledge. For example, more and more artificial intelligence is used for marketing purposes, and it's used in public spaces. In fast food, at McDonald's has menus that watch people to gauge their facial reactions to see which products that they like. And of course, now in America, you have McDonald's recording the voices of people as they go through the drive-through, with the idea that they're not actually they're anonymizing the person themselves. But what they've found is that actually what they're trying to do with recording the voices is to optimize the process of the drive-in. But at the same time, we don't really know what they're doing with the data. This is one of the problems with a big data collection is the archive. What happens to the information afterwards? And what we do know is that there is a whole industry of data analytics which decides, for instance, do female workers take more time at bathroom breaks than male workers. Are people of Middle Eastern descent who workers, are they more compliant to authority than workers from Asia? And all these constellations of variables are being taken to decide probably on the type of people to hire.
And the use of this technology to spy on people, I mean, governments like Israel, for example, spying on Palestinians, the technology can be a very powerful tool in social platforms and others and tracking people. Should that be a concern for the working class?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for people working, I tell my students, be careful of what you put on Facebook, because, okay, when you get your first job and you work for a large corporation, your hiring is not going to cost them so much money. But later, as you rise up the ranks to aspire to management, you become a more valuable commodity. And so the scrutiny of your, let's say, promotion or your next job, there'll be many people who will be looking at your social media history to find out exactly who you are, because, at some point in time, it'll be not what they see on paper on your CV, but how well you are as a person who can fit into their family,
And there was an Associated Press reporter, young reporter, who was fired because of a campaign by Israeli supporters saying that she'd been critical of some of the policies of the Israeli government when she was in college. So this tracking of people to silence them or intimidate them, is that a real threat?
I think so, yeah. When you do like privacy audits of technologies, one of the biggest things you look at is you put a weight on the threat. How much threat does this technology pose to the individual? What kind of threats can that technology do? And for example, apps, when they do security audits of apps, they say, what does this app expose people to? Does it reveal information about their bank account? Does it reveal information about their location?
Or reproductive rights?
Reproductive rights. And of course, all this information is happening in the background of the app, without oftentimes the awareness of the individual themselves. There's a good example, just like last week, Air Canada took away the rights of one employee's family. Usually when you work for an airline, your family gets free air mileage or free trips. And Air Canada took away the rights of this woman who worked for Air Canada for many years of her daughter, because her daughter had posted online on social media a scathing critique of Air Canada because of the current chaos that's taking place in the airline industry. So I mean the harms are there. The harms can be. There can be so many different types of harms. For example, surveillance in cars today. Cars are increasingly, insurance companies are using telematics where they, for a nice price, you can have a 40% reduction in your car insurance if you let them install a black box into your car, and that car basically analyzes your driving behavior. The problem here is that we don't know what takes place with that information afterwards. Is that information sold to medical insurance companies? Is that information sold to other companies that that want to for some reason use your behavioral data to sell you something?
Isn't that capitalism, profiting off of introduction of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I call what's taking place today feral capitalism. It's capitalism unleashed, and it's interesting because as my research into emotional or empathetic surveillance takes place, I see it as a sort of an inversion of capitalism, where it no longer is concerned with the consumer or essentially the productivity of the worker in terms of controlling the physical body. It turns inward, which again goes back to biopolitics, which is the monetization of bare life, of life's essential forces, emotions.
And what is the solution? Because we are in a system, a world capitalist system, not just in the United States, Western European countries, but also China and other countries where this is a requirement to live in society, this system.
Yeah, I mean, increasingly, I think people don't have a choice, or the choices are very few. Especially what you have today with the transnational workplace, where you have these huge, large corporations setting up businesses in other countries and using this very generic human resource template. And especially in Japan, what you see today is you see increasing labor disputes taking place in a country where labor disputes are usually workers don't take grievances against their companies because it is seen as a form of shame. But now what we see happening is that you see a trend towards people starting to contact their unions because they're being run in a certain way. For example, Amazon's very invasive surveillance technologies are seen in Japan as a violation of long-standing trust between employer and employee. In Japan, there's this extreme amount of trust that goes on. For example, in Japan, it is not unusual for an employer to share for an employee to share their health data with their employee. That would never go on in Europe or in America because a person's health data information is considered to be sacred and private. Whereas in Japan, it's regularly shared with their employer because of this bond of trust that the employer is going to only use that for good purposes.
And Zuckerberg in the United States, they've taken over the General Hospital, or they named the Zuckerberg Hospital, and now the city of San Francisco is contracting out to Zuckerberg data collection. Should people be concerned about that?
Well, yeah, of course. Especially the health industry is is very scary. What's going on? For example, in the UK, the NHS, the National Health Organization, which was in many ways a pioneer for socialized medicine. The company that's taking care of their data now is Plantier, which is a US-based company which has large contracts with the NSA and the CIA, and is run by Peter Thiel.
Who's supporting Trump and actually was involved in trying to support the coup and the insurrection.
In Venezuela?
Here in the United States.
Ah, okay.
Thiel was meeting and he supports Trump.
I'm not surprised. So,
as well as Larry Ellison of Oracle, who's a big government contractor.
It's a very scary situation when you have a nation's wealthiest people who are embracing ideas which are in many ways moving towards authoritarianism. It's scary.
This social crisis that we face, political, economic, social crisis, it seems to be exacerbated by the use of this technology.
Yeah, I think the technology itself is fast forwarding many things that are sort of, things that have been in the works for a long time are now being fast forwarded because of that. And
even travel now. I mean, as far as control of travel, and if you make a bad comment, you may not be able to get on a plane.
Yeah, I mean, it's a security now is sort of reaching that very dystopian stage. I when I talk about airport security, I'm always reminded of the movie Bullet. Where I think it's either in San Francisco or Los Angeles, the Steve McQueen, the cop, he says, get the airport security, and there's only two policemen that are doing airport security. Now it's, of course, it's just the opposite.
Thousands. Well, what do you see as the future? Because you've been doing this research, you're trying to find out how this impacts particularly working people in the workplace. How do you see a fight back or a challenge to this introduction of technology and the use of technology to increase exploitation and spying on working people?
I try to check my pessimism. Orwell said that when asked about the future, he said, "Picture the heel of a military boot stepping on someone's face over and over again." I mean, that always comes back to me. But I am an optimist at heart, and I think that It's kind of like the Snowden era, like before Snowden, no one had only the conspiracy theorists all of a sudden proven right that Big Brother is watching. But the Snowden revelations was a pivotal point in public recognition of mass surveillance. What Snowden did made people aware, and in many ways, maybe mass surveillance exists today, but people are conscious of it now, and people are more careful. And studies have shown since the Snowden revelations in 2013 or 14, whenever they came out, people are more careful about what they search for on Wikipedia or Google, because they know that data is going somewhere. And I think public awareness is really important. Like Eisenhower said with the military-industrial complex when he was on his way out. The only way we're going to stop this dystopian trend of the military-industrial complex is to ensure we have a vigilant citizenry. And I think that's what we need today. Is we need more people to be aware. We need more education in universities. Unfortunately, right now, most of the courses that are being conducted at university levels in AI are in business schools, which only talk about the wonders of AI. They don't talk at all about the ethics of AI, the need of regulation, the need of transparency, the need of algorithmic audits, all the things to ensure that the future of AI is really human-centric and that it ensures the best interests of the worker.
And today, the United States is trying to extradite Julian Assange for exposing through WikiLeaks the crimes of the United States in Iraq. It seems that the warning to people who do raise these issues is if you do get this information, you do release it, you're going to be in trouble personally.
Yeah, I think Edward Snowden said just a little while ago, when it is a crime to expose crimes, then you understand that the real criminals are, who the real criminals are. And it's a really sad thing about Julian Assange, because, I've had a chance to talk with someone who was a good friend of his and invited him to my school prior to his case before he had his ankle bracelet put on, let's put it this way. And he was really interested to come to speak to our school because he had just released the Afghan logs, or the Iraqi, the logs in Iraq with
We showed the war crimes of the United States.
Yeah. And of course, sadly enough, there are not enough people who are coming to his defense. And when I say defense, you always need celebrities to come to his defense. And of course, we've had the Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, who's been a strong advocate of Assange, and we've had John Pilger, some notable people, and of course, Daniel Ellsberg. All these people, came to his aid. I remember Daniel Ellsberg, one of the things he said was really interesting. He said, when I would leak the Pentagon Papers, it was really hard work. I had to physically photocopy like 24 manuscripts, and it took me hours and hours and hours to do this. And then I had to send them to all the newspaper. And Julian Assange has this wonderful website where he just uploads it to the website, and then all of a sudden it gets released universally. Yeah. And
you're visiting the United States in San Francisco. There are over 80 billionaires in San Francisco, 180 billionaires in California. The conditions you see here, the people out in the streets, the homeless, the massacres that are taking place, is this shocking to you?
It is, because I was born in Canada, I was raised in Canada. When I visit Canada, it's very... Okay, there's poverty, but you don't see it to the extent that you see here. You see basically middle-class people. In Europe, the same. You don't see poverty or the level of aggression that takes place. And of course, in Japan, you don't see any poverty at all. It exists, but not...
Sometimes people in tents in parks, Osaka, I know, castle.
Yeah, Osaka people have always been known for their emotionality. But the level of poverty here is really frightening, and it's very sad because I think almost $1 trillion goes every year to nebulous threats to the military-industrial complex, when the real threats to national security are the lives of people here, are poverty, mental illness, the lack of social services.
There's a limit on those costs of those, and we've got to spend more money in Ukraine or encircling China.
Yeah, this is all insane. I mean, there's been some very good empirical studies done on the actual need of defense spending, cost-effective defense spending, and it's it always comes out that you can easily shave off $350 billion, and America will be as safe as it ever was.
But there's the military-industrial complex, and the Democrats, Republicans, both are bound to these defense contractors and increasing the wealth of the military-industrial complex.
I mean, I always tell my students, sure, if you want to play in the casino of the stock market, go ahead. But if you really want to make money and you have no conscience at all, buy defense stocks, because they'll always go up. But that would be, like I said before, that means like you have no social consciousness at all, because essentially what you're doing is you're fueling poverty. No, not poverty, but you're fueling innumerous suffering that's going on around the world.
The cost of war.
The cost of war is really terrible. It's, I think, the defense industry is, of course, it's something that Eisenhower always warned about, and it's unfortunate.
I want to thank you for joining us. We've been talking with Peter Mantello. He is a professor in Japan whose focus has been technology introduction in the workplace, automated technology, and studying the role of this technology as far as the exploitation of working class and their conditions. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for having me.